Welcome back to DogFoodCon. We are joined by Michael Dowden.
Hi.
Hello, Michael. You want to tell us about yourself?
I suppose I could. I'm a software developer,
Yeah.
unsurprisingly. Microsoft MVP, Google Developer Expert. I write JavaScript.
Yeah. What kind of JavaScript?
TypeScript.
I love TypeScript. Everything I do now is TypeScript.
Yeah. PWA is Node.js.
Yeah. Good. Well, what's your talk about here today?
So my talk here is from horror story to fairy tale, how to write code people want to read.
Yeah. What makes code that people want to read?
We'll come to the talk and find out. No.
I will.
On the podcast.
Yeah, they're not here.
Help them out.
Oh, okay. So what makes code that people want to read is making sure that you can look at it and understand what it's doing, which sounds pretty self-explanatory, but seems to actually be pretty challenging when you put it into practice. I think what's more important is actually to talk about why we need to care that code is readable.
Yeah.
And really quickly, we spend at least 10 times more of our time reading the code than writing the code, right? You can't write anything without first reading what's already there and understanding it and processing it, and then you can write more code. So reading happens a lot more than writing does. And also, which is maybe a little bit less obvious, is that the complexity of the code we write directly impacts who is going to be able to easily read that code later.
Yeah.
Right? So if I write really obscure, challenging code, maybe a junior developer is going to come along later, and they're going to have a much, much harder time understanding that code than another senior engineer would. And so in that standpoint, if I don't take the time that required to make the code even more readable, I'm actually making it harder for me to bring new people on the team.
Yeah, you're just giving yourself more work later.
So interestingly enough, the next person to come into that code base may very well be you.
Yeah.
And any code that you wrote, so let's just say 10 weeks ago,
Yeah.
might as well have been written by somebody else.
Right.
Because at the time you're writing a bit of code, you've got context in your head. You've had meetings, you've had discussions, you've read documentation. And so you know all these things, and all that goes into whatever code you write. And if we don't capture that context in some way, through comments, through external documentation, by making sure that the code flows in a specific way, any of that context that isn't captured is lost for the next person. Mm-hmm. And now they've got to kind of rebuild that context in order to understand not only what you did, but why you did it.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, how many times have you done something like, this isn't how I would normally do it, but in this situation it makes sense. And the next person comes along and says, well, that was stupid. Why would anybody do it that way? And so they fix it, and then there's bugs for weeks, and all because somebody couldn't be bothered to write a comment or whatever. So
I train new developers, and new people, I always have to tell them, like, you are writing this, like, the computer doesn't care about your code.
Right.
Like, you are writing this code for other people, and maybe even specifically yourself, and it's much better to be clear rather than clever. Because people are, they think of engineering and software and things, and they think it's like a clever kind of, like, we're going to come up with innovative things and stuff. But really, it's like, you want your code, other people to be able to understand it.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, like, nobody builds big, impressive things all by themselves. It's always multiple people, and the code is really a communication medium. Like, these were the things in my brain that I'm trying to get the computer to do.
Sure.
And I want you to be able to understand it later whenever you're looking at it.
Let's think, what are some of the obstacles we run into? When you're running code, how much does it cost to run that code? That number is going down all the time, right? It is constantly serverless architecture.
Yeah.
I have an application that I ran in production for a year, and I didn't pay a penny on it. I mean, because up to like thousands of users sometimes, no big deal. It's practically free for us to run code.
Right.
You think about compiling or interpreting the code. The people that are writing JavaScript engines and are writing C++ compilers are very, very smart. Those compilers will do a better job of optimizing our code than we as developers are ever going to do.
Yeah.
So thinking about code from an optimization standpoint there are obvious exceptions to this, but for the most part, that's not where we need to focus our time. The most expensive part of software, for the most part, is actually in writing it and maintaining it. And maintaining it much more so if it has any sort of shelf life,
right?
Which hopefully it does if it's a good product, right?
And and that's why with things like just like our team is going to have standards about how we're going to name things and where we're going to put stuff. And
absolutely.
Classes.
Absolutely.
Like,
well, there's an infinite number of ways to solve any problem with code, right?
Right.
And you can, in fact, by reading someone's code, you can typically tell who they've been working with, because people that work together tend to approach the problems in the same way over time.
Right.
I was back in college. I was a teaching assistant, and I could always tell who the students were that would work together in groups.
Yeah.
And it was really obvious when somebody copied somebody else's stuff.
I mean, it's like when you talk about writing code, it's writing. It's like I was an English major in college. And you can always tell there's consistency between the things that people write from time, whether it's English or Java.
Yep.
Yeah.
Whatever else.
You get used to certain phrasing.
Right.
Like you use it all over the place.
And because of that, though, what good code looks like may actually vary from team to team.
Yeah.
That's important to understand, right? Every team is going to have, and maybe it's because of their industry or because of the personalities on the team or just the problem domain. There's all types of different things that may factor into what makes good code for your team. But then you have to kind of have standards, agree to that, write that up, build that into your pair programming practices or into your code review practices, and make sure that you are helping each other with that, because there's a lot of things that we can use linting or static code analysis to find for us, and by all means write some rules to enforce it. But other things, it's kind of a little bit of personal perspective, and in order to avoid that whiplash, well, I want it this way, well, I want it this way, that back and forth code review with two different people trying to tell you to do. No, don't do that. Have team agreements and then work towards that.
Yeah. Like I have very strong opinions about how things should look and be named and blah blah blah. None of them are based on anything. Like it's all personal preference and stuff. But I contribute to a lot of different code bases out there, and the number one thing I have to do is throw all that away. Yeah. And then whenever I go into a thing that already exists, make sure that I'm following the rules that they've laid out.
Yep.
Because if I start editorializing on my own in my own thing, now, okay, there's 100 people and I'm one person, I just messed up 99 people's stuff. Yep. And even if mine is better, that doesn't help anyone.
Right.
It slows your team down. It makes it more difficult for people to understand how it works. It makes it more difficult to train new people. You were increasing the amount of time that you have to train somebody when you bring them on board. There's all kinds of negatives to these kinds of things, and it's important to throw your ego out the door on them.
It really totally is.
Yeah.
Right. And I think focusing on the things that are important is really difficult for a lot of people. In my code review experience, we'll spend time in code reviews talking about whether an annotation should go above a line or next to a line, and it's maybe we could decide this beforehand, but you really don't want to spend your time talking about how your program works, talking about where something should go, because you're just wasting a whole lot of time that could be used for something substantive, right?
Absolutely.
No one in software makes money on your code directly. It's all this abstraction to run a business and help people make money. And if you were wasting your time arguing about where where semicolons go, it's somebody's paying you to do this. Stop.
If there's anybody out there that still gets paid based upon or even evaluated based on the number of lines of code they write, please let me know so that I can yell at your boss for you.
Well, all right. Yeah.
Wait, hold up.
How much are we talking per line? So, okay.
So just to maybe make this a little more concrete, what are some of the things that I can do to make my code more readable right now? At work, we talk about you gotta do your class comments, you gotta do your Java doc, and sometimes that helps more than other times, but that's not the only thing we can do.
Oh, absolutely not. So, two really easy hints. First one, functions do something. So there'd better be a verb in your function name.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Let's all teach developers what verbs are by
Yeah.
the English major says.
Verbs are action words.
Yes.
The function needs to tell you what it is doing, not what it is acting on. We can, in basically any tool in any language, we can look at what the parameter list is and figure out what it's acting on. We need to know what it's doing so that when you're reading the code that calls the function, the code reads. It makes sense. This function is doing this thing to this object that I'm passing in. Awesome. If it doesn't have an action, if there's no verb, you have to click into that function and read that function's code.
Yeah.
And if it calls other functions, you got to read those functions' code. And now you're in 10 files reading all this function code just to understand what this one call back here did,
All right.
which can be solved just by telling me what it did by changing the name.
Right.
So verbs and function naming, super duper important. The other thing is to always consider ambiguity. So English is particularly bad about ambiguity. There's lots of words that mean lots of different things. One of my favorite examples is the abbreviation ST.
Okay.
Probably, maybe it means state, maybe it means street.
Stack trace even.
Turns out the disambiguation page on Wikipedia for the abbreviation ST has over 30 entries. Like half of them are related to addresses, which
Yeah.
means even if you know that it's in the context of an address, it still doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Right.
So using abbreviations with lots of different options, using words that can mean different things or that are hard to read versus read,
Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And some things are different in written English. The ambiguities are different than in spoken English because in spoken English I can say there,
Right.
and those are three different words with three different meanings, or two, and two, three different words, three different meanings,
Right.
right? But we have similar types of problems in written English, and it's
Yeah.
problematic.
You can't spell.
Well, the red one reminded me of a thing that happened with a new person. It was like I was doing a code along, right? And like I was saying red out loud. And like after a while we realized he was writing RED, but I was like we were writing like a DAO and we were doing, the CRUD app. So read meant like
To read
to
something.
read something, but like he's like, what would be red?
What?
Why is everything red?
Why can't this one be yellow?
What if I like blue though? That's my own question.
Yeah, and it was, I never thought of things like that. But yeah, even like just spoken versus written, and you never know how people are
No,
gonna
not at all.
encounter this
No.
stuff and read it and stuff. And like, for instance, new people always want to shorten things and make the names very,
Yeah.
very compact.
I don't like typing either. I get it.
Oh yeah, but they're afraid of making things too long.
Yes.
But like, I would much rather you I understand it sucks whenever things like get this and that and that and that and that and that and buy that, whatever. Not great, right? But I would prefer that over X. Like,
So let's use an example. I have a store
yeah,
and I charge tax. So maybe in the order object somewhere, I have a field that says tax. What is stored in that field? What data type is stored in that field?
I don't know.
No, you have no idea. Because is the tax, is it a sales tax?
Yes or no, even.
Right? Is it a yes or no? Is it a ratio? In other words, it is the multiplier that I apply to the total in order to calculate what the tax is. Is it a tax rate?
Yeah.
Or is it a total amount of dollars that the tax is?
Right.
It's not clear,
No, it's not clear at all.
right? And potentially there's lots of different types of taxes that may be applied to a given order.
Right.
So which one is it? Right? And so we need to know that. And so you got to be really careful that you have enough words as part of a variable or a function that it actually gives you the full context of what the heck this thing is.
Yeah.
And having a shared language in some things is very important too. I was talking to a
Yep,
coworker
yes.
about this recently because in a lot of the code at my job, we talk about merchants, and merchants are objects. They save them in a database. They have an ID.
Yep.
But in a business context, for the bank associated with that merchant, they have a merchant ID, which is a custom thing for the bank. So we have a merchant ID and a merchant ID. And
my
they are not the
goodness.
same thing.
Oh,
So, what we've done is we've talked about MIDs, MIDs, which are usually different from the merchant ID, but it becomes very difficult to talk about
yes,
those things,
totally.
especially when it's entrenched, and now
Yes.
it's like, how do you change that
Yes.
vocabulary now?
Absolutely. One of the challenges that I ran into in one company, it was an insurance company, and there's a huge whole vocabulary in insurance, right? Well, it turns out there's some really great industry standard documentation about how, as an industry, they want to communicate between companies.
Yeah.
Great, very well defined. But instead of doing that, this company spent millions of dollars on custom integrations anytime they had to work with a third party because they had a different vocabulary. So instead of spending that money to fix the vocabulary so that they can now interrelate with the rest of the industry freely, they spent that money one integration at a time, creating adapters essentially between their wrong vocabulary and the way everybody else does it.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that's a decision you can make, I suppose, but it matters, right? That context matters, the vocabulary matters, and for you as a company to do your thing is great, but maybe PRs, I love this. Am I talking to a marketing team? A PR is probably a press release,
Oh my God,
but
yes.
to a development team, right? PR is a pull request,
Yeah.
and they're
Yeah.
right, and so you run into stuff like that all the
I'm
time.
gonna do a press release about my pull request. So TypeScript is like, okay, I write a lot of JavaScript,
Okay.
right? And I've typically had stuck to JavaScript forever. But then, like,
Same.
and then I found TypeScript, and like this TypeScript solved all kinds of these problems for me because, like, you know, one of the things with JavaScript is like the thing you were saying, like you have no idea what a thing is going to return.
Yep.
Like you don't even know,
Yep.
like it's a string or it's a boolean or it's an object or it's a thing, and like types give you a lot of that context.
Yes.
And the more of them you use, it feels to me like the more clear your code
Yes.
becomes because you get to, you know, writing classes and objects and things is like that's building the structure of a
Yep.
thing. And I'm sorry.
If you don't have types, then your function definition isn't really setting very clear expectations
Yeah.
about what you're going to give in and what it's going to give you back.
Right. Yeah, because sometimes, like, and people will take advantage of that in ways that are, like,
No, not at all.
destructive. Like they'll write methods, functions that will, like, sometimes they'll return a boolean, and if it goes further down, now it's returning a string. And then it's like, okay, on the other side, when I call this, now I have to handle both it being a string and a boolean. And it's like, oh my God, you just made so much work for somebody, and they have no idea you've planted this time bomb.
Yes. Yeah. It's one of those things that, like, when, you know, I just learned to become a developer just a few years ago, and people, you know, have very strong opinions about what are easy languages to learn
Yeah.
on. And usually, like, I learned Java. This was my first programming language, effectively. And, like, you know, people say that Java's too hard to learn as the first thing. Like, oh, it's so much easier to pick up Python or JavaScript
goodness,
or
no.
something. No,
No.
it's not, because, like, you don't know what you're doing there
Yeah.
because you don't have the keywords there that tell you exactly what you're doing. And
Yep.
if you're missing them, you can't miss them. Like,
Yep.
Yeah.
it won't compile if you don't tell it what you want to do. And you miss things when you go to Python.
Absolutely. Yeah, and honestly, I really like compiled languages for teaching because
Me too.
compilers give you a lot more immediate feedback and usually very good feedback
Yes.
to help you understand how to correctly form things and make structures. And Java in general, people don't like it because it tends to be very verbose, and part of that's how we choose to work with the language. There have been, for many, many years, kind of standard ways, the Java way of doing things that tends to be very verbose. But you know what? Verbosity is actually really good
Yes.
when you're learning something.
Yeah.
It's helpful. And I learned in BASIC and then C, and didn't do Java until later, but I've coded Java for 20 years. And that's one of the language. I like it. It's fine.
Yeah.
I do a lot more front end and TypeScript work now, a lot more on Node.js. That's kind of Java seems it's not entirely true, but Java seems to be a lot more relegated to the enterprise types of jobs, and I want to do more of the startup and the new fun things.
Right.
And
Right.
I've chosen my technology a little bit based upon the types of kind of the way the ecosystem works. But,
Right, but that complaint about verbosity,
No,
right? It's like,
yeah.
Anytime you're reading someone else's code, you're learning.
yeah, absolutely.
So
Totally.
it applies even if you're not new. If you're just new to a particular piece of code, like it's great, and this is what makes TypeScript so nice to use. Is that like, oh hey, I know what's going on here, or at least more or less.
Well, also, like, do we make that decision when any other medium, like, are people like, I only read Dr. Seuss because Dr. Seuss wrote the shortest,
words.
yeah, he used the least number of words. He's the best author in the history. And this book I'm reading has too many words, so it's not for me.
If we took out all those A's and thes, God, this could be so much shorter. We wouldn't have to read so much. We wouldn't have to type so much. Way better.
Yeah.
And no one knows what's going on anymore, but that's fine.
Oh, I won't read your newspaper if you don't use the Oxford comma. Forget it. No, I'm out. Right? Like, what?
Yeah. Well, yeah, like you said, like Java is specifically very verbose at times, right? But like, and it's good for helping people learn. And so like, you always constantly, when you bring new people on board, you need to help them learn your system.
Yep.
So like, I don't think verbosity is even a negative in most of the time. Like, of course you can go overboard with it. You can with anything. But there's a balance to strike, and I don't think that going all the way to, like Python, like, you don't name anything. Like I started learning machine learning stuff, right? And like I learned that the machine learning people, like they'll call, I have an array with 50,000 images broken up into bytes, and it's an array inside of array inside of array, and they'll call this whole thing X. And it's like, how was I supposed to know what that meant? Like in my Hello World tutorial, like there's no way. And so like I think that when you're starting, at least the more verbose that you are, the easier it's going to come.
I mean, you end up writing, if you don't have it in the language, what is happening here, you've got to write it in your method names, you got to write it in your comments, you got to write it somewhere, or else it's undocumented, and somebody is just going to go in there and have to read every function, like you said.
I will say that where verbosity breaks down is if you just use more words for the sake of using more words, and it doesn't actually clarify what you mean.
Yeah,
that's true.
And like in Java, you can end up with your reader stream builder factory interface, and you're like, what does that even mean? What?
Yeah, for sure. All right, is there anything you want to plug? Twitter?
Wow,
social
sure.
media?
Totally. Twitter, I'm MR Dowden on Twitter. My consulting business is Andromeda. Our website is Andromeda 16, and we do coding, front-end development, TypeScript, and accessibility work. And Martine Dowden and I published an accessibility book this year.
What's that called?
Called Approachable Accessibility.
Nice.
Basically, it's how to get your team started on a web accessibility initiative.
Okay, good. All right, check that out on, I assume, Amazon.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Where else?
Wherever you buy books.
At the book place. All right, thank you so much
Awesome.
for joining us,
Thank you very
Michael.
much. Appreciate
this
it.
was fun.
Thank you.
All right, cool.
Sweet. Thank you so much.